The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty platform of Cedar Ridge Station, a ramshackle depot that seemed to have been assembled from whatever timber the railroad company could spare. The weathered boards groaned under the weight of departing passengers, while the acrid smell of coal smoke and machine oil hung heavy in the air. Margaret Maggie Holloway stood beside the worn leather trunk that contained everything she owned in this world, her gloved hand gripping her younger brother Samuel's thin shoulder. "Is he here, Maggie?" Sam's voice was barely audible above the hissing of the locomotive's cooling boiler. The boy's pale face turned up to her, hope flickering in his gray eyes despite the weariness that seemed to have settled permanently into his 11-year-old features. Maggie scanned the small crowd gathered at the depot ranchers and dusty chaps, merchants in their Sunday best, and women whose sharp gazes dissected every newcomer with surgical precision. No one stepped forward. No one met her searching look with recognition or welcome. "He'll be along directly," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. The letter of introduction felt heavy in her reticule, its promises now seeming as insubstantial as smoke. Mr. Theodore Barnes had seemed so earnest in his correspondence, so eager for a helpmate to share his prosperous ranch. She'd memorized every line of his letters during the long journey from Philadelphia, clinging to phrases like comfortable home and good prospects. The train's whistle shrieked its departure, and the great iron beast lurched forward, leaving them behind in a cloud of steam and cinders. As it disappeared around the bend, taking with it their last connection to the world they'd known, Maggie felt the weight of watching eyes upon them. "Mail order bride," someone whispered, the words carrying on the desert wind like tumbleweeds. "Another one of those Eastern women thinking she'll find a fortune out here. Theodore Barnes ain't been seen in town for near on 2 weeks," a woman in a severe black bonnet said to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Probably lit out for California goldfields, leaving this poor creature high and dry." Maggie's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high. She'd endured worse whispers in Philadelphia, the speculation about their father's debts, their mother's death from consumption, the auction that had taken their home. At least here, the gossip was about her choices rather than her misfortunes. Sam coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made several people step back. Maggie pulled him closer, feeling the bird-like fragility of his bones through his thin coat. The medicine money was nearly gone. And without Mr. Barnes, without a home, "Perhaps we should inquire at the hotel," she said, though she knew their remaining funds wouldn't cover more than a night or two. "Mr. Barnes may have left word." "Ain't no hotel in Cedar Ridge that takes in unaccompanied women." The speaker was a broad-shouldered man with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. His eyes were not unkind, but neither were they helpful. "Especially not women of uncertain circumstances." The crowd was growing, drawn by the prospect of scandal like flies to spilled molasses. Maggie recognized the signs, the clustering of bonneted heads, the pointing fingers barely concealed behind fans, the men's speculative leers. In a moment, someone would suggest she try the saloon, where women of uncertain circumstances could always find work. The thought made her stomach clench. "My circumstances are quite certain, sir," she said, producing the letter with as much dignity as she could muster. "I am Mrs. Theodore Barnes's intended bride, and I'll thank you to—" "Ted Barnes is a fiction, miss." A new voice cut through the murmurs gravelly, low, and carrying an authority that made the crowd part like the Red Sea. "Made-up name by some confidence man who's been running this scheme up and down the rail line. You're the third woman this month to show up with one of those letters." The speaker emerged from the crowd like a mountain emerging from mist. Caleb Boone stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad enough to block the sun, his face weathered by wind and sun into something that might have been carved from the red rocks surrounding the town. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale gray and distant, and they moved over the assembled townsfolk with the wary attention of a man who'd learned to watch his back. Maggie felt the ground sway beneath her feet. That's impossible. We corresponded for months. He sent money for passage. Just enough to get you here. I'll wager. Not enough to get you back. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. The carefully hoarded coins in her purse would barely buy food for a week, let alone return passage to Philadelphia. And even if they could go back, what awaited them there but the charity ward where consumptives went to die? Sam's coughing grew worse, his thin body shaking with the force of it. Specks of red appeared on the handkerchief he pressed to his mouth, and the crowd stepped back further, fear of contagion overcoming their appetite for gossip. "Please," Maggie said, hating the desperation creeping into her voice. "Is there no respectable employment to be had? I can sew, I can cook. I have some knowledge of herbcraft." "Widow Henderson might need a seamstress," someone suggested. "But she don't take in lungers." The Chinaman's laundry? Full up with celestials already. Each suggestion came with its own impossibility, its own locked door. The sun climbed higher, and the platform offered no shade. Sweat gathered beneath Maggie's traveling dress, and Sam swayed on his feet. "Someone fetch Doc Pritchard," she heard herself say. "The boy needs—" "Doc don't work on credit," the sheriff said, not unkindly. "And before you ask, neither does anyone else in Cedar Ridge." The crowd's judgment pressed in from all sides, suffocating as the heat. Maggie had faced poverty before, faced whispers and closed doors, but she'd always had somewhere to retreat to, even if it was just a cold attic room. Here, there was nowhere to go but the open desert, and that meant death as surely as a bullet. "Well now," a woman's voice rose above the others, shrill with malicious delight. "Seems to me there's one establishment in town that's always hiring women, down at the Red Door. Big Sally don't ask too many questions about. She's with me." The words fell into the conversation like boulders into a pond, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. Caleb Boone moved forward with the deliberate grace of a man who knew his own strength, reaching down to lift Maggie's heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing at all. "Mrs. Boone," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the platform. "My wife." The lie hung in the air between them, impossible and necessary all at once. Maggie stared up at him, this stranger who'd just claimed her with 2 words, and saw something in his winter sky eyes that might have been understanding, or pity, or simply the recognition of one outcast to another. I don't," she began, but he shifted the trunk to one shoulder and extended his free hand to Sam. "Come on, boy, ranch is a fair piece out, and you look like you could use some of Martha's soup and a proper bed." Sam looked up at Maggie, question in his eyes. She could refuse, could cling to the shreds of propriety and independence, could insist on waiting for a man who would never come. Or she could take the hand this stranger offered, step into a lie that might keep them alive long enough to find truth again. The crowd watched, hungry for her decision. The sun beat down mercilessly, and somewhere a hawk cried, circling on the thermals above the desert. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Of course. Forgive me. I'm a bit lightheaded from the journey." Caleb nodded once, as if they'd concluded a business transaction, and started toward a weathered wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. Maggie took Sam's hand and followed, feeling the crowd's eyes boring into her back, their whispers rising like a dust devil in their wake. As they reached the wagon, Caleb set the trunk in the bed with surprising gentleness. "Name's Caleb," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "The boy needs shelter and medicine. I've got both. We can sort out the rest later." "Why?" she whispered back, helping Sam climb onto the wagon seat. "Why would you—" "Because I know what it's like to stand alone while the wolves circle," he said, his eyes distant as the horizon. "And because Theodore Barnes weren't the only one running a scheme. My foreman's been sending out letters too, thinking to find me a wife whether I wanted one or not. Seems fitting to turn his meddling to some good." He climbed onto the driver's seat and took up the reins, his large hands gentle but firm with the horses. "You need a home. I need folks to stop trying to marry me off to every female west of the Mississippi." Seems we might could help each other." As the wagon rolled away from Cedar Ridge Station, Maggie looked back once at the platform where her old life had ended. The crowd was already dispersing, moving on to the next sensation, the next scandal. In a week, she'd be old news. Just another mail-order bride who'd found something different than what she'd ordered. Sam leaned against her shoulder, his breathing labored but steady. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but somewhere in that emptiness was a ranch, a bed, and perhaps if she was very lucky, a chance to build something better than the life she'd left behind. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they headed into the unknown, and Maggie Holloway began her transformation into Mrs. Caleb Boone, whoever that might turn out to be. The Circle B Ranch sprawled across the landscape like a testament to stubborn endurance, its weathered buildings huddled against the endless sky. As the wagon crested the final hill, Maggie got her first glimpse of what would be her new home, if she could even call it that. The main house stood solid but unpretentious, built from local timber and adobe, with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. Beyond it, she could see a barn, several outbuildings, and corrals where horses moved like shadows in the late afternoon light. "It ain't much," Caleb said, the first words he'd spoken in the hour since they'd left town. "But it's sturdy." Sam had dozed fitfully during the journey, his head heavy against Maggie's shoulder. Now he stirred, blinking owlishly at their surroundings. "Is this where we'll live?" "For now," Maggie said carefully. Still uncertain what arrangement she'd agreed to, the word wife echoed in her mind. But Caleb had made no move to touch her, had barely looked at her during the drive. Whatever his reasons for the public claim, she sensed they were more practical than romantic. A woman emerged from the house as they pulled up, middle-aged, sturdy as a fence post, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her sharp eyes took in Maggie's travel-stained dress and Sam's pallor with one sweeping glance. "Martha," Caleb said by way of introduction. "This is Mrs. Boone and her brother Samuel. They'll be staying." Martha's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline, but she merely nodded. "I'll air out the blue room. Boy looks like he could use some broth and a bed." "I can help," Maggie said quickly. "I don't expect to be waited on." "Course you don't," Martha interrupted, but not unkindly. "Nobody who can't pull their weight lasts long out here. But first things first, let's get the boy settled." The house's interior was a surprise after its plain exterior. While simply furnished, everything was well made and scrupulously clean. Navajo rugs covered polished wood floors, and the walls bore a few pieces of good furniture that seemed at odds with Caleb's rough appearance. Maggie glimpsed a parlor with books on shelves and a piano covered with a dust cloth. Speaking of a different time, perhaps a different woman's touch. Martha led them to a room at the back of the house, small but bright, with a window overlooking what appeared to be a kitchen garden gone mostly to seed. "This'll do for the boy," she said. "You'll be in the room across the hall." "Separate rooms," the words slipped out before Maggie could stop them. Martha's look could have peeled paint. "Mr. Boone's orders. Whatever arrangement you've got is between you and him. But in this house, we do things proper." Relief and confusion warred in Maggie's chest as she helped Sam into the narrow bed. His forehead felt warm, but no warmer than usual. She'd learned to gauge his fevers like a farmer gauging rain, always watching for the storm that might sweep him away. "I'll brew some willow bark tea," Martha said, her voice gentling as she watched Maggie smooth Sam's hair. "Got some other herbs might help too. You know anything about doctoring?" "Our mother taught me about herbs before she—" Maggie swallowed. "Yes, I know a bit." "Good. Garden needs tending anyway. Might as well put it to use." By the time Maggie had unpacked their few belongings and seen Sam settled with Martha's herbal tea, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red. She found Caleb on the porch, sitting in a chair that creaked under his weight, a cup of coffee balanced on the rail beside him. "We need to talk," she said He nodded toward the empty chair beside him. Figured we might. Maggie sat carefully, aware of the impropriety but too tired to stand on ceremony. Why did you claim me as your wife? Told you. My foreman's been trying to marry me off. Now he can stop. He took a sip of coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon. You needed help. I've got room? Simple as that. Nothing's ever that simple. A ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. No, I suppose it ain't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you'll have the protection of my name, food and shelter for you and the boy. In return, you'll help Martha with the house. Maybe start that garden up again. We'll tell folks we were married by proxy. Papers coming later. That should stop most of the talk. And the rest of it, the expectations. Now he did look at her, those winter sky eyes unreadable. I'm not looking for a wife. Mrs. Holloway. Had one of those. Didn't end well. His gaze returned to the horizon. You're safe here. That's all I'm offering. And all I'm asking. Before Maggie could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both tense. 3 riders appeared from the growing darkness, pulling up at the porch steps. The man in the lead was thin as a whip, with calculating eyes that reminded Maggie of a card sharp she'd once seen in Philadelphia. Boss, the man said, his gaze sliding from Caleb to Maggie with obvious interest. Heard you picked up a package at the station today. My wife, Caleb said flatly. Mrs. Boone, this is Jake Thornton, my foreman. The others are Pete and Miguel, hands here. Jake's smile didn't reach his eyes. Wife, is it well now? That's sudden. And here I was thinking those letters I've been seeing around were just talk. What letters? Caleb's voice carried a warning that raised the hair on Maggie's neck. Oh, just some correspondence I noticed when I was in town. Amazing how much a man can learn from the postal clerk after a few drinks. Jake's gaze lingered on Maggie. Course, now I'm wondering if maybe there's more to this story. The only story is that I'm married now, so you can stop your meddling. Caleb stood, and Maggie was reminded again of his sheer size. That means Mrs. Boone gives the orders in the house, same as any ranch wife. You'll treat her with respect, or you'll find yourself looking for work elsewhere. Clear. Crystal, Jake touched his hat brim in a mockery of courtesy. Welcome to the Circle B, Mrs. Boone. I'm sure we'll all get along just fine. After the men headed to the bunkhouse, Maggie found her hands were trembling. He doesn't believe it. She said, he knows. Jake Thornton knows which side his bread's buttered on. Caleb interrupted. Long as he does his job and keeps his mouth shut, I don't much care what he believes. He paused at the door. Lock your door at night, both doors yours and the boys. Just a precaution. The next days fell into a pattern. Mornings. Maggie worked with Martha, learning the rhythms of the ranch house. Afternoons, while Sam rested. She attacked the garden with a vengeance, clearing weeds and taking inventory of what might be salvaged. She found feverfew growing wild along the fence, mint that had taken over one corner, and even some valerian struggling through the neglect. Caleb kept his distance during the day, riding out early and returning late. But she noticed things how fresh firewood appeared each morning, stacked neat beside the stove. How a new bottle of the medicine Sam needed materialized on the kitchen table. Though she hadn't asked, how broken things were mysteriously repaired overnight. The ranch hands were another matter. Pete, an older Mexican man, was polite enough, even helpful when she struggled with the heavy garden gate. But Jake watched her with speculation that made her skin crawl. And some of the others whispered when she passed. One evening, a week after their arrival, she was tending the garden when she heard voices from the barn. Playing house with some fortune-hunting female. Jake was saying, mark my words, she'll bleed him dry and light out the minute she finds a better prospect. Maybe, another voice said. But maybe not. You see how she tends that sickly brother that ain't the act of someone just looking for easy money. Every confidence game needs a prop. Jake replied, sick kid's perfect for gaining sympathy. Maggie's hands stilled on the herbs she was gathering. Is that what people thought, that Sam was just a tool for manipulation? You're awful interested in the boss's business. Pete's voice cut in, mild but pointed. Maybe you should worry more about those missing cattle from the south pasture. Ain't nothing missing that I know of, Jake said, but something in his tone had shifted. You suggesting something? Old man. I'm suggesting we all got work to do that don't involve gossiping like church ladies. The voices moved away, but Maggie remained frozen among the herbs. Missing cattle, suspicion and resentment, and underneath it all, the question that plagued her own thoughts. What exactly had she gotten them into? That night, she found Caleb cleaning a rifle on the porch, his movements methodical and sure. There's trouble brewing, she said without preamble. Your foreman. I know about Jake. His hands never paused in their work. Man's useful, but he's got ambition. Been hoping I'd take on a partner, give him a chance to buy in. My getting married puts a crimp in those plans. So I've made things worse. No. He set the rifle aside and looked at her directly. Jake was going to be a problem regardless. At least now I know where he stands. He paused. How's the boy? Better. I think the willow bark helps. And Martha's been teaching me about some local plants. There's a root desert willow. She calls it that might help his lungs. Martha knows her business. Her people have been in these parts longer than any of us. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch settling around them. Somewhere, a coyote called, answered by another in the distance. I should warn you, Caleb said finally. Town council meets end of the month. They'll expect us to make an appearance, newly married couple and all. Can you handle that? Maggie thought of the gauntlet of eyes and whispers, the questions and speculation. Then she thought of Sam, sleeping peacefully for once, his medicine bottle full on the nightstand. I can handle it, she said. Good. He stood, gathering his rifle. One more thing. Been meaning to say you're doing good work with the garden. Martha says it hasn't looked that good in years. He was gone before Maggie could ask about the slip, about whose garden it had been before. But as she prepared for bed, checking the locks as had become habit, she found herself wondering about the woman who'd played that dust-covered piano, who'd planted the herbs now growing wild, who'd left such emptiness behind that a man would claim a stranger as his wife rather than risk feeling again. Outside, she heard footsteps on gravel the night watch Caleb had posted since her arrival. Whether to keep trouble out or gossip in, she wasn't sure, perhaps both. In the morning, there would be bread to bake and clothes to mend, a garden to tend and a brother to nurse. There would be suspicious looks and whispered words. The challenge of maintaining a fiction that felt increasingly real with each passing day. But tonight, for the first time in months, Maggie Holloway misses. Caleb Boone felt something that might have been hope. The morning of the town council meeting dawned clear and merciless, the kind of day that baked the earth and made even breathing feel like work. Maggie stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the collar of her best dress, a gray wool that was far too warm for the climate, but the only thing she owned that seemed respectable enough for the occasion. You look pretty, Sam said from the doorway. The past 3 weeks had brought color back to his cheeks, though the cough still lingered like an unwelcome guest. Pretty won't matter much if they see through this charade, Maggie muttered, then forced a smile. You're to stay here with Martha. Mind her well, and don't overexert yourself in the garden. I wish I could come, he said wistfully. I want to see you be Mrs. Boone in front of everybody. The words twisted something in Maggie's chest. Each day the lie felt less like deception and more like possibility, a dangerous blurring of lines that could only end badly. Caleb waited by the wagon, dressed in what must have been his church clothes, a black coat that stretched tight across his shoulders, and clean boots that looked uncomfortable on feet more used to worn leather. He helped her up without comment, his hands careful and impersonal as always. The ride to town passed in tense silence. As they neared Cedar Ridge, Maggie could see other wagons converging. Families in their best clothes come to witness the monthly spectacle of local governance and, no doubt, to get their first good look at Caleb Boone's mysterious new wife. "Remember," Caleb said as they pulled up outside the meeting hall, "we were married by proxy in Denver. Papers are coming by post. You came ahead because of your brother's health. And if they ask for details, then we tell them it's none of their business." He came around to help her down, and for a moment they stood close, his hands at her waist. But try to make it polite. The meeting hall buzzed with conversation that died the moment they entered. Maggie felt the weight of every stare as Caleb guided her to a bench near the middle, not so far forward as to seem presumptuous, not so far back as to seem ashamed. Well, the voice was silk over steel. "If it isn't the new Mrs. Boone." Silas Merrick stood in the aisle, blocking their path. Everything about him spoke of money and power, from his tailored suit to the gold watch chain across his vest. His eyes, dark and calculating, moved over Maggie like she was horseflesh at auction. "Merrick," Caleb said, the single word carrying enough frost to chill the room. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." Silas extended a manicured hand toward Maggie. "Silas Merrick. I own the Double Bar M Ranch, among other interests." Maggie placed her hand in his briefly, suppressing a shudder at his touch. "Mrs. Caleb Boone," she said firmly. "Yes, so I've heard. Such a sudden development. Why, just last month. Caleb here was swearing he'd never remarry." Silas's smile was all teeth. "Love can certainly change a man's mind, can't it?" "Among other things," Caleb said, moving Maggie past him. "Excuse us." They'd barely taken their seats when the whispers started, rustling through the crowd like wind through wheat. "Mail-order bride. I heard brother's consumptive, bringing disease. No papers yet. Mighty convenient." Maggie kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, but she could feel heat climbing her cheeks. Beside her, Caleb sat like granite, seemingly oblivious to the speculation swirling around them. The meeting was called to order by Mayor Hutchins, a portly man who seemed more interested in the sound of his own voice than any actual governance. Discussion droned on about water rights and road repairs, but Maggie could feel the real agenda building like a thunderstorm. Finally, it came. "Before we adjourn." Silas Merrick rose, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "I believe we need to address a matter of some delicacy." The mayor looked uncomfortable. "If this is about personal matters, Silas, it's about the law." Silas interrupted smoothly. "State law requires all marriages to be properly documented and filed. I'm simply concerned that we maintain proper standards in Cedar Ridge. After all, we've had problems before with irregular arrangements." Maggie felt Caleb tense beside her. "Now," Silas continued, "I'm sure Mr. and Mrs. Boone have all their paperwork in order, but given the unusual circumstances, a proxy marriage, no local witnesses, the bride arriving separately, perhaps they could enlighten us." "Since when do I answer to you about my personal affairs?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "Since those affairs might affect the whole community." Silas turned to address the crowd. "We all know what kind of women come west claiming to be brides. Some are legitimate, certainly, but others, well, there are names for women who enter into temporary arrangements for money." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Maggie started to rise, fury overcoming sense, but Caleb's hand on her arm stopped her. Then, unexpectedly, he stood himself. "You want to question my wife's character?" His voice filled the hall. "This woman who spent 3 weeks nursing her sick brother, working sunrise to sunset in my house, bringing Martha's garden back to life. This woman who hasn't asked for one thing beyond shelter and honest work." He moved into the aisle, and people shrank back from the controlled fury in his movements. 20 years I've been in Cedar Ridge. 20 years I've kept to myself, minded my business, dealt fair with every man. My word's been good enough for every contract, every handshake deal. But suddenly my word ain't good enough when I say this is my wife. "Caleb," the mayor said nervously, "nobody's questioning your word." "Aren't they?" Caleb turned, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "How many of you have bought cattle from me on nothing but a handshake? How many times have I stood good for a neighbor's debt, helped bring in a harvest, sat up with sick stock, but now you want papers, proof?" His voice dropped, but in the silence it carried to every corner. "Fine. You want proof, here's proof." Before Maggie could process what was happening, Caleb strode to where she sat, bent down, and lifted her bodily from the bench. The crowd gasped as he cradled her against his chest, her trunk from the depot seemingly weightless in comparison to his current burden. 3 weeks ago," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "this woman stood abandoned at the depot, victim of a cruel deception. Every person there saw her shame, her fear. And what did this town offer? Suspicion, judgment, suggestions that would make any decent person sick." He shifted her weight, and Maggie, shocked into stillness, could only stare up at him as he continued. "So yes, I claimed her, called her my wife before I knew her name, before I'd heard her story. Because that's what a man does. He protects those who need protecting. And if that ain't good enough for you, if you need papers and seals and witnesses, then you don't know me at all." With that, he strode down the aisle, still carrying her, leaving a wake of stunned silence. It wasn't until they reached the wagon that he set her gently on the seat, his hands lingering just a moment at her waist. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Shouldn't have done that. Made a spectacle." "Caleb," her voice came out breathless. "That was—" "Jake's behind this." His jaw tightened. "Probably feeding Merrick information, stirring up trouble. Man wants me to need a partner, wants me vulnerable. Having a wife makes me look stable, settled, unless she's the wrong kind of wife." The ride back began in silence, but this time it felt different, charged with something unnamed. Finally, Maggie spoke. "What happened back there, lifting me like that?" Figured they needed reminding. His hands tightened on the reins. "That day at the depot, I didn't just claim you with words. Actions matter more than paper out here." "But why defend me so fiercely? You barely know me." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, my wife, my first wife, came from back east too. Good family, educated, everything proper. This town smiled to her face and whispered behind her back, called her uppity, delicate, not suited for ranch life. I let it go on. Figured she needed to prove herself on her own. By the time I realized how deep it cut her," he shrugged. "Too late for fixing by then." They'd nearly reached the ranch when riders appeared on the road ahead. Jake Thornton led them, with several hands Maggie didn't recognize. "Boss," Jake called out, his tone too casual. "Heard there was some excitement in town." "Nothing that concerns you," Caleb said evenly. "Well now, that's where you might be wrong." Jake's smile was sharp. "See, Mr. Merrick's made me an interesting proposition. Says if the Circle B was to come up for sale, say, if its owner found himself in legal difficulties, he'd make sure I had first chance at buying." "That's so—" Caleb's voice could have frozen hell. "Course, I told him you weren't the selling type. But then he pointed out how complicated things can get when a man's domestic arrangements ain't exactly regular. Property rights, inheritance claims, all sorts of tangles." One of the other riders nickered. "Especially if the woman turns out to be working more than one angle, if you know what I mean." The words had barely left his mouth when Caleb moved. One moment he was sitting calmly on the wagon seat. The next, he'd hauled the man from his saddle and slammed him into the dirt. The crack of fist-meeting jaw was loud in the sudden stillness. "Anyone else got opinions about my wife?" Caleb stood over the groaning man, his stance inviting challenge. The other riders backed their horses away. Even Jake looked uncertain. "Now," Caleb continued conversationally, as if he hadn't just laid a man out cold. "Any hand that wants to keep working the Circle B will show proper respect to Mrs. Boone. Anyone who can't manage that can collect their pay and clear out. That includes you, Jake." Jake's face darkened. "You threatening to fire me after 15 years? I'm telling you how it is. You stir up any more trouble with Merrick, spread any more gossip about my wife, and you'll be looking for work in Mexico. Clear." For a moment, violence hung in the air like heat shimmer. Then Jake smiled, cold and calculating. "Crystal clear, boss. My apologies to Mrs. Boone for any misunderstanding." He wheeled his horse around, the other riders following. The man on the ground stumbled to his feet and limped after them, cradling his jaw. Caleb climbed back onto the wagon as if nothing had happened, but Maggie could see the tension in his shoulders, the white knuckles on the reins. "You've made an enemy," she said quietly. "Already had one, just out in the open now." As they pulled into the ranch yard, Sam came running from the garden, Martha close behind. "Maggie, did you tell everyone? Are you really Mrs. Boone now?" She climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. The events in town, Caleb defending her, carrying her, fighting for her honor, crashed over her like a flash flood. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm really Mrs. Boone." Caleb had already headed for the barn, his broad back rigid with suppressed emotion. But Martha caught Maggie's arm, her weathered face unusually soft. "Saw Jake and his boys ride out earlier," she said quietly. "Looked like trouble brewing." "There was an incident." Martha nodded slowly. "Been coming for a while now. Jake's got ambitions, and Merrick's got the money to fund them. You just gave them the excuse they were looking for." "Then perhaps I should..." "Should nothing." Martha's grip tightened. "First time in 5 years I've seen Caleb stand up for anything besides this ranch. Man's been dead inside since Eleanor passed. Maybe it takes a fake wife to remind him how to be a real husband." She bustled Sam inside, leaving Maggie standing in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. From the barn, she could hear the rhythm of Caleb working the steady beat of hammer on anvil, fixing what was broken, preparing for what was to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Jake and Merrick wouldn't let this stand. The town would buzz with gossip about the scene in the meeting hall. The fiction of their marriage would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Maggie Holloway Boone walked to the garden where desert willow grew wild. She'd been lifted up, carried, defended not because she was property to be protected, but because someone had chosen to stand between her and the world's cruelty. For the first time since stepping off that train, she began to believe she might truly belong here, in this harsh land where actions spoke louder than words, and a man's promise still meant something, even if that promise was built on a necessary lie. The storm built throughout the day, dark clouds piling up against the mountains like a threat made manifest. By afternoon, the air hung thick and electric, making the horses pace restlessly in their stalls and setting everyone's nerves on edge. Maggie stood in the kitchen, grinding dried feverfew for Sam's headaches. When the first fat raindrops struck the window, within moments, the drops became a deluge. Then something worse, hail the size of river stones, hammering against the roof with violence that made conversation impossible. "Get away from the windows," Martha shouted over the din, pulling Sam back from where he'd pressed his face to the glass. "This ain't no ordinary storm." Through the chaos of wind and ice, Maggie heard something else, the panicked bellowing of cattle and the shouts of men. Caleb burst through the door, water streaming from his hat and coat. "North pasture fences down," he yelled. "Stock scattering. Martha, get everyone to the root cellar if this gets worse." His eyes found Maggie's. "You know anything about treating injuries?" "Some," she said. "Might need it before this is over." Then he was gone, back into the tempest. The next hour passed in a blur of howling wind and crashes as pieces of the ranch were torn away. The kitchen windows shattered, letting in a fury of rain and ice. Maggie and Martha worked frantically to move food stores and medical supplies to safety, while Sam huddled in the hallway, coughing from the cold air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the worst passed. The hail softened to rain, then to drizzle. In the eerie quiet that followed, they heard the barn door banging and the continued lowing of frightened cattle. "Stay here," Martha commanded, grabbing a lantern. But Maggie was already reaching for her shawl. The damage was worse than she'd feared. Part of the barn roof had collapsed, and the chicken coop was completely destroyed. Its occupants scattered, or worse. Fence posts lay like scattered matchsticks, and the garden she'd worked so hard to restore was buried under inches of ice and mud. But it was the human toll that made her stomach clench. Pete sat propped against the barn wall, cradling an arm bent at an unnatural angle. Two other hands she didn't recognize bore cuts and bruises from flying debris. And Caleb. "Just a scratch," he said, though blood ran freely from a gash above his eye. "See to Pete first." Maggie had helped her mother 10 neighbors back in Philadelphia, but nothing had prepared her for this. Still, she pushed down her fear and set to work. Pete's arm needed setting a job that required Caleb's strength while she guided the bones back into place. The man bit down on a leather strap and made no sound, though sweat beaded his weathered face. "Where's Jake?" someone asked as Maggie cleaned and bandaged cuts. "Him and his crew were supposed to be watching the north pasture." Caleb's expression darkened. "Good question." The answer came with the dawn, as the sun revealed the full extent of the damage. Jake Thornton rode up with 3 of his men, their clothes suspiciously clean and dry. "Hell of a storm," Jake said, surveying the destruction with satisfaction poorly disguised as sympathy. "Heard you lost most of the north herd." "Funny how you heard that before checking in," Caleb said quietly. "Funnier still how the fence was already down when the storm hit." Jake's eyes widened in mock innocence. "Are you suggesting something, boss?" "I'm suggesting you're fired." Caleb's voice was flat. Final. "Clear out your gear and get off my land. Now hold on." "The only holding that's going to happen is by the sheriff if you're not gone in an hour." Caleb turned his back, dismissing him. Jake's face flushed dark red. "You'll regret this, Boone. You and your so-called wife both. Mr. Merrick, don't take kindly to being disappointed." After he left, Maggie found Caleb staring at the ruined garden. "I'm sorry," he said. "You worked so hard on it." "Plants grow back," she said, "but the medicine stores, Sam needs—" "We'll get more. Town run tomorrow, if the roads are passable." He paused. "You did good last night. Pete would have lost that arm without proper setting." Before she could respond, a cry from the house sent them both running. Sam lay in his bed, fever-bright and struggling to breathe. The storm's cold had triggered something in his lungs, and each breath came with a wheeze that terrified Maggie more than any wind. "Desert willow," Martha said urgently. "And mullein if we have any left. Girl, you know what to do." Maggie flew to the medicine stores, but the storm had destroyed much of what they gathered. The desert willow was there, but precious little of it. Enough for 1, maybe 2 doses. "It's not enough," she whispered, measuring carefully. "He needs more, and it doesn't grow near the house." "Where?" Caleb asked. Martha said there's a stand near Skeleton Ridge, but that's 3 hours' ride in good weather. He was already reaching for his coat. "More like 5 with the roads washed out." "You can't go now," Martha protested. "Not with Jake's crew out there stirring trouble, and the storm damage." "Watch me." He paused at Maggie's side. "Tell me exactly what to look for." She described the plant, its narrow leaves, its trumpet-shaped flowers, where it liked to grow. Her hands shook as she spoke, fear for Sam making her voice crack. "I'll find it," Caleb said, and something in his tone made it a promise. The hours crawled by. Sam's breathing grew more labored despite the tea Maggie coaxed down his throat. She bathed his forehead, held his hand, whispered prayers and promises. Martha bustled in and out, bringing broth and fresh water, but her usual briskness couldn't hide her worry. "Storm took out the telegraph lines," she reported. "No way to reach Doc Pritchard even if he'd come." Late afternoon brought riders, but not Caleb. Silas Merrick himself appeared at the gate with half a dozen men, including Jake. "Mrs. Boone," Merrick tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Heard you had some storm damage. Thought I'd make an offer." Maggie stood on the porch, acutely aware of her isolation. Most of the hands were out trying to round up scattered cattle. "We're not interested in selling." "You might be, once you hear the terms." His smile was cold. "See, I know about your brother's condition. Consumption's an expensive disease. And with the ranch in such poor shape, your husband gone." He spread his hands. "I'm prepared to be generous, enough to get the boy proper treatment back east." "My husband will return shortly," she said firmly. "Will he?" Jake spoke up. "Awful lot of accidents can happen to a man riding alone. Washed out trail, spooked horse. Why, he might not be found for days." Ice formed in Maggie's stomach. "What have you done?" "Nothing yet," Merrick said. "But time's wasting. Sign the ranch over to me, and I'll personally guarantee safe passage for you and the boy back east. Even throw in enough cash to see him treated at one of those fancy sanatoriums." "And if I refuse?" His shrug was eloquent. "Accidents happen, to husbands, to sick boys who wander out in the cold, to women who don't know their place." Maggie's mind raced. She needed time, needed to think. I'd need to see papers, legal documents. I can't just—" "Of course." Merrick reached into his saddlebag. "I took the liberty of having them drawn up, all perfectly legal, witnessed and sealed. All they need is your signature as Boone's wife." She took the papers with trembling hands. The legal language swam before her eyes, but she forced herself to read slowly, carefully. Behind her, she heard Sam's labored breathing, Martha's worried murmur. "I need time to consider," she said. "Sunset," Merrick said. "That's all the time you get. And Mrs. Boone, don't think about trying to leave. My men are watching all the roads." After they left, Maggie sank onto the porch steps, the papers crumpling in her fist. How had it come to this? 3 weeks ago she'd been nobody. Nothing, a failed mail-order bride with a dying brother. Now she held the fate of a ranch, a man's life's work, possibly the man himself. "What are you going to do?" Martha asked quietly. "I don't know." The words came out broken. "If Caleb's hurt, if Sam—" She couldn't finish. "Caleb Boone's harder to kill than that," Martha said firmly. "And your brother's stronger than he looks. Don't you go signing nothing out of fear." But as the sun sank lower and Sam's breathing grew more ragged, fear seemed the only emotion left. Maggie mixed the last of the desert willow tea, her hands shaking as she helped Sam drink. "Where's Caleb?" Sam whispered. "He'll be back soon," she lied. "With medicine to make you better. You like him." It wasn't a question. "He's good. To us." "Yes," she whispered. "He is." "Don't let them take his home." The effort of speaking exhausted him. Maggie held his hand as he drifted into restless sleep, his chest rising and falling in stuttering rhythm. The sun touched the horizon, painting the storm-washed sky in shades of blood and gold. Soon, Merrick would return for her answer. Sign away Caleb's ranch, betray the man who'd saved them, or refuse and risk Sam. Risk everything. She stood, walked to the porch, stared out at the damaged land that had become, impossibly, home. The garden lay in ruins, but already she could see signs of life, a sprig of mint poking through the mud. The hardy rosemary bent but unbroken. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm coming, or just the echo of the last. Then hoofbeats, a lone rider coming fast, too fast for the treacherous roads. Maggie's heart leaped, then sank as she recognized not Caleb but Pedro, one of the hands. "Senora!" He pulled up hard, his horse lathered and blowing. "The patron, mister." Caleb, his horse came back without him. "We found blood on the saddle." The world tilted. Maggie gripped the porch rail, forcing herself to think through the roar in her ears. "Where?" "Near Skeleton Ridge, where the trail washed out. We're getting men together to search, but—" He glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm coming in. Be hard to find anyone in that." "Saddle a horse," she heard herself say. "I'm coming with you." "Senora, no, is too dangerous." "That's my husband out there." The words rang with truth that surprised her. "I know the plant he was looking for, know where it grows. I can help." Martha appeared with Maggie's coat and a bag of medical supplies. "You sure about this, girl?" Maggie thought of Sam struggling for breath, of Caleb somewhere hurt and alone, of Merrick waiting like a vulture to pick their bones. "I'm sure." She turned to Pedro. "We ride now, and send someone to town, not for the doctor. For the sheriff. Tell him Silas Merrick threatened my family." As she swung into the saddle, she caught sight of the papers still lying on the porch. The wind caught them, sending them tumbling across the yard like broken promises. Let Merrick come at sunset. He'd find neither a signature nor surrender, but a woman who'd finally learned what was worth fighting for. Thunder cracked overhead as they rode out, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The search party found Caleb just as the second storm hit, lying unconscious at the bottom of a wash where the flash flood had swept him. His leg was twisted beneath him, and a gash on his temple had painted the rocks with blood. But he was alive barely. "Careful," Maggie commanded as the men lifted him. She'd already fashioned a splint from branches and torn petticoats, her hands steady despite the rain lashing at them. "His leg's broken. Move him wrong and it could cripple him permanent." They rigged a travois behind Pedro's horse, and Maggie rode beside it, shielding Caleb's face from the worst of the rain. In his delirium, he muttered words she couldn't catch except one. Eleanor, the name of his dead wife, spoken with such anguish that Maggie's heart clenched. Back at the ranch, they found chaos. Merrick's men had come at sunset as promised, only to be met by Sheriff Watson and 3 deputies. Martha stood on the porch like an avenging angel, Sam's rifle in her hands. "About time you got back," she said, but Maggie saw the relief in her eyes. "Boy's holding on, but barely. You find the plants?" Maggie held up the precious bundle of desert willow, harvested from where Caleb had fallen. His last conscious act had been to gather what Sam needed, securing it in his saddlebag even as the floodwaters rose. "See to Caleb," she told Martha. "I'll brew Sam's medicine." The next hours blurred together, mixing the tea with hands that trembled from exhaustion, coaxing it down Sam's throat, listening to his breathing slowly ease. In the next room, she could hear Martha and the sheriff's wife working on Caleb, the occasional groan telling her he still lived. It was near dawn when Sheriff Watson found her in the kitchen, mechanically grinding more herbs. "Mrs. Boone," he said gently, "I need to ask you about Merrick's threats." She told him everything: the papers, the ultimatum, Jake's implications about arranged accidents. The sheriff's face darkened with each word. "Been suspecting Merrick of strong-arm tactics for a while," he said, "but this is the first time anyone's been willing to speak up. You'll testify to this in court." "Yes," the word came out firm. "Certain. He threatened my family." "Your family." The sheriff studied her. "That's what you call them, even though—" He trailed off, but she knew what he meant. Even though the marriage was a lie, even though she'd known them less than a month. "Yes," she said again. "My family." After he left, Maggie sat beside Caleb's bed. Martha had done good work. The leg was set properly, the head wound cleaned and bandaged, but he hadn't woken, and his skin burned with fever. She found herself talking to fill the silence. "Sam's breathing easier. The medicine worked, just like you promised it would. Sheriff Watson says Merrick will face charges. Jake, too. Once they find him. Seems he lit out when the law showed up." No response. She dipped a cloth in cool water, bathed his face. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about what Martha said, about Eleanor. Was she the one who played that piano, planted that first garden?" His eyes moved beneath closed lids, and his lips shaped a word. She leaned closer. "Failed," he whispered. "Failed her." "Hush," Maggie said, though he likely couldn't hear. "Rest now." But he grew more agitated, caught in some fever dream. His hands clenched the sheets as he muttered broken phrases. Too late. Couldn't stop them. Should have been there. Martha appeared in the doorway. "He gets like this sometimes. Anniversaries, mostly. Day she died." "What happened?" Maggie asked softly. Martha hesitated, then sat heavily in the other chair. "Was 5 years ago. Eleanor was from Boston. Delicate thing, but she loved him fierce. They'd been trying for a baby, and she'd finally caught 4 months along, happy as I'd ever seen them." Maggie's hand stilled on the cloth. "Caleb was out with the herd, moving them to summer pasture. Gone 3 days. While he was away, some men came to the ranch. Said they represented buyers interested in purchasing. Eleanor was too polite to run them off, even though something felt wrong. Merrick? Never could prove it. But those men, they pushed their way inside, demanded to see the books, the deed. Eleanor tried to make them leave, and there was a struggle. When we found her, she'd fallen down the porch steps, or been pushed." Maggie's stomach clenched. "The baby." "Lost. Eleanor followed 2 days later. Never woke up to tell us exactly what happened." Martha wiped her eyes roughly. "Caleb came home to find his whole world gone. Blamed himself for not being here, for not protecting her. Shut himself away after that, stopped living except for the work. Until 3 weeks ago," Maggie said slowly, "when he saw me at the depot. When he saw a woman needing protection and couldn't walk away again." Martha stood. "I'll sit with him. You need rest." But Maggie couldn't rest. She moved between sick rooms, brewing medicine for Sam, cooling Caleb's fever, maintaining the vigil love demanded even when love was still just a possibility, a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow. On the second day, Caleb's fever broke. His eyes opened, focused on her face with painful clarity. "You're here," he said, voice rough as sandpaper. "Where else would I be?" He tried to sit up, winced. "Sam, the medicine is working. He's breathing easier." She pressed him back against the pillows. "You nearly died getting it." "Worth it," he said simply. Then, Merrick. "Facing charges. The sheriff has statements from me, from Martha, even from some of the hands who heard Jake making threats." Something shifted in his expression. "You stayed. You could have signed those papers, taken his money, gotten Sam to safety. But you stayed." "This is our home," she said, the words feeling like truth. "You don't abandon your home or your, She paused, uncertain how to finish. "Your what?" His eyes searched hers. "Your husband," she said quietly, "even if he's only that in name." His hand found hers, calloused fingers gentle. "Maggie, there's something you need to know about why I really claimed you that day. It wasn't just about stopping Jake's matchmaking or giving you shelter." She waited, heart hammering. "You reminded me of her, not in looks, but in when I saw you standing there, refusing to break even though the whole world was against you. I thought I thought maybe I was being given a second chance, to do right this time, to protect someone who needed protecting. I'm not Eleanor, Maggie said carefully. I'm not delicate or refined or— No, he interrupted. You're not. You're stronger than she ever was. Strong enough to fight for this place. For Sam. For— He squeezed her hand. For us. If there is an us. Before she could respond, commotion erupted outside. Through the window, she could see riders approaching not Merrick's men, but townsfolk. Reverend Harlan, Mrs. Henderson, even some of the women who'd whispered behind their hands at the depot. Martha met them on the porch, and Maggie could hear the conversation drift through the window. Came to help, the Reverend said simply. Heard about the storm damage, about Mr. Boone being hurt, Christian duty to help neighbors in need. Since when are we neighbors? Martha's voice was sharp with old hurt. Where was this Christian duty when Eleanor needed it? We failed then. Mrs. Henderson spoke up. Her usual stern face softened with what might have been shame. Failed to see past our own prejudices. Failed to welcome her properly. Can't fix that now, but maybe we can do better this time. Over the next days, the ranch transformed. Men worked to repair the barn and fences. Women brought food, helped with nursing duties, even started clearing the storm-damaged garden. And through it all, Maggie felt the walls of suspicion slowly crumbling. It's you, Caleb said one evening, watching from his bed as she directed the replanting efforts through the window. You did what Eleanor and I couldn't, made them see you as you really are, not as what they expected. I just did what needed doing, Maggie protested. Exactly, no pretense, no trying to prove yourself. Just honest work and genuine care. He shifted, winced at his healing leg. I've been thinking, this arrangement of ours, maybe it's time to make it real. If you're willing. Maggie's hands stilled on the medicine she was preparing. Caleb, you don't owe me anything. I'm not looking for gratitude or— Not talking about gratitude. His voice was firm. I'm talking about a man who spent 5 years dead inside watching a woman bring his home back to life. About waking up looking forward to seeing your face, hearing your voice. About being willing to fight again because there's something worth fighting for. Your leg's not even healed, she said, deflecting. The fever could have addled your thinking. My thinking's clear as it's been in years. He caught her hand as she passed. But I'll wait, long as it takes for you to be sure. Just don't rule it out because you think I'm offering charity. What I'm offering is partnership, real marriage, real home. That night, Maggie sat in the garden among the new plantings. Sam was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Caleb was on the mend. The threat of Merrick was diminished, though not eliminated. And somewhere in the midst of crisis and courage, she'd found something she'd never expected. What do you think, Mama? She whispered to the stars. Is it wrong to love a man who called me wife before he knew my name? To want a life built on a foundation of necessary lies? The wind stirred the desert willow, and she could almost hear her mother's voice. Love built on sacrifice and protection is never a lie, my dear. It's the deepest truth there is. When she went inside, she found Caleb reading by lamplight one of the books from Eleanor's shelves. Poetry, he said, almost embarrassed. She loved it. I never understood it before, but now— He cleared his throat. Read, I do not love you as if you were salt rose, or topaz, or the arrow of carnations the fire shoots off. I love you as certain dark things are to be loved, in secret, between the shadow and the soul. Maggie crossed to him, took the book gently from his hands. You're not the only one who's been dead inside, she said, but I think we might teach each other how to live again. In the distance, thunder rumbled, not threatening this time, but promising rain for the new garden, life for the desert, hope for hearts learning to beat again. The autumn air carried a bite that warned of winter coming, and with it came news that set the entire ranch on edge. Jake Thornton had been spotted in town, drinking heavily and talking louder. Worse, he'd been seen leaving the bank with Silas Merrick, both men wearing the satisfied smiles of conspirators who believed their plan foolproof. "They're up to something," Pedro reported, hat in hand as he stood before Caleb on the porch. The rancher could walk now, though he still favored his healing leg. Jake was showing papers around the saloon, claiming he had proof that your marriage ain't legal. Maggie's hand found Caleb's shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over the weeks of his recovery. What kind of proof could he possibly have? The kind that can be bought, Caleb said grimly. Merrick's got deep pockets and friends in high places. Wouldn't be hard to manufacture something. The blow fell 3 days later. Sheriff Watson arrived with papers that made Maggie's blood run cold, a lawsuit challenging the legitimacy of their marriage and, by extension, her right to any say in ranch affairs. The claim was backed by an affidavit from someone claiming to be Theodore Barnes, stating that Maggie had contracted to marry him and was therefore legally bound to that agreement. "It's nonsense," the sheriff said apologetically. "Everyone knows Barnes was a fiction, but Merrick's got himself a judge in Millfield who's willing to hear the case. You'll have to appear and defend yourselves." When? Caleb's voice was steady, but Maggie could see the tension in his jaw. 2 weeks. I'm sorry, Caleb. I know this is Eleanor all over again." "No." Caleb stood, his hand finding Maggie's. "This is nothing like Eleanor. This time, we fight back." That evening, Maggie found herself in the study, surrounded by papers and ledgers as she and Caleb prepared their defense. Sam sat curled in the corner with a book, his color better than it had been in months thanks to regular doses of desert willow tea. "There must be something we can use against them," Maggie muttered, scanning through correspondence. "Some proof that Merrick's been orchestrating this from the beginning. Proof's hard to come by when money changes hands in back rooms." Caleb said. He paused, studying her. "There is another way." "What do you mean?" "We could make it real. The marriage." His words hung in the air between them. "Get married proper, in church, with the whole town as witness. Take away their main argument." Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. Over the past weeks, what had started as convenience had deepened into something else: shared glances over breakfast, hands that touched while working and lingered, conversations that stretched late into the night. But this, "You'd do that?" she asked softly. "Bind yourself to me permanently just to save the ranch?" "Not for the ranch." He moved closer, his fingers tilting her chin up. "For you, for Sam, for the life we've started building. The question is, would you have me not as a convenient fiction, but as a husband in truth?" Before she could answer, Sam's excited voice interrupted. "Maggie, look! This paper was stuck in the book. It's got Jake's writing on it." The boy held up a yellowed sheet covered in cramped handwriting. Maggie took it, her eyes widening as she read. "It's a confession," she breathed. "Or close to it. A letter from Jake to someone, talking about his plans to partner with Merrick, about forcing Caleb out through whatever means necessary. And look," she pointed to a line. "He mentions Eleanor, says her death was unfortunate but useful for their purposes." Caleb went very still. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Where did this come from?" "The book was in Jake's old bunk," Sam said. "Martha asked me to help clear it out, and I thought it was one of yours. I didn't mean to snoop, but—" "You did good, boy." Caleb ruffled Sam's hair, but his eyes remained hard. "This changes things. This proves conspiracy. Maybe worse." They worked through the night, building their case. Martha brewed endless pots of coffee while they documented everything: the forged letters that had brought Maggie west, Jake's sabotage of the ranch, Merrick's threats and coercion. By dawn, they had a stack of evidence that painted a clear picture of calculated harassment and fraud. "It's still our word against theirs in some places," Maggie said, rubbing tired eyes. "The judge might not accept." A knock at the door interrupted her. Reverend Harlan stood on the porch, and he wasn't alone. Behind him gathered what seemed like half the town misses. Henderson, the banker mister, Clearwater, even some of Merrick's own ranch hands. Reverend Caleb opened the door wider. "What's all this?" "Christian witness," the Reverend said simply. "We've come to make statements about what we've seen and heard. Mrs. Henderson has information about the men who visited Eleanor. Mr. Clearwater can testify about suspicious financial transactions. And these gentlemen," he indicated the ranch hands, "have decided their consciences matter more than Merrick's payroll." One of the hands stepped forward, hat in hand. "We heard things. Mr. Boone saw things. Jake bragging about cutting your fences before the storm. Merrick talking about how he'd own the Circle B by winter. We kept quiet out of fear. But what they're doing to your missus, it ain't right." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. These people who had once whispered and judged were now standing with them, choosing justice over convenience. "There's more," Reverend Harlan said. "I've brought my church register. If you're willing, I can perform a ceremony today. Make your union official before God and man. Take away their legal ground entirely." Caleb looked at Maggie, a question in his eyes. She thought about all the reasons to say no, the short acquaintance, the uncertain future, the danger still lurking. Then she thought about mornings in the garden, evenings by the fire, the way he'd risked his life for Sam's medicine, how he'd stood between her and the world's cruelty from the very beginning. "Yes," she said simply. The ceremony was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had seen. They held it in the garden, among the plants that had survived storm and neglect to bloom again. Maggie wore her gray dress with Martha's lace shawl over it. Caleb stood tall despite his healing leg, his eyes never leaving her face. Sam gave her away, proud and solemn. The townspeople crowded around, witnesses to a union that had begun with a lie and transformed into truth. Even Sheriff Watson was there, badge polished and papers ready to file the moment the vows were spoken. "Do you, Margaret Holloway, take this man?" "I do," she said, firm and clear. "Do you, Caleb Boone, take this woman?" "With all my heart," he answered, breaking protocol and making several women dab at their eyes. When Reverend Harlan pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that made promises words couldn't capture. The crowd erupted in cheers that would have scandalized proper society but felt exactly right for Cedar Ridge. The celebration was interrupted by thunder of hooves. Merrick arrived with Judge Blackwood from Millfield, both men's faces dark with fury when they saw the gathered crowd. "What's the meaning of this?" Merrick demanded. "A wedding," Sheriff Watson said mildly. "All legal and proper. In fact, I've got enough witnesses here to fill a courtroom, all ready to testify about various matters, including this interesting letter young Sam found." He held up Jake's confession. Merrick's face went pale, then flushed dark red. "That's you can't prove. Actually, we can." It was Mr. Clearwater who spoke, the mild-mannered banker's voice carrying surprising authority. "I've prepared a full accounting of suspicious transfers from your accounts to various parties, including payments to one Jake Thornton that coincide with damages to the Circle B. I believe the territorial authorities will be very interested." Judge Blackwood was already backing toward his carriage. "This matter appears to be resolved. The marriage is clearly valid, and I see no grounds for—" "You see grounds for getting out while you can," Sheriff Watson suggested, "unless you'd like to explain your own sudden wealth to investigators." The judge fled. Merrick stood his ground a moment longer, hatred burning in his eyes as he looked at Maggie. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is." Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between Merrick and his bride. "You're done here. If I see you near my family again, we'll settle this the old way." "Your family?" Merrick spat the words like a curse. "A fortune hunter, a consumptive brat, and a broken-down rancher. You deserve each other. He wheeled his horse and galloped away. But not before one of his own men called out, "I quit. Merrick, I'll testify to whatever the sheriff needs." As the dust settled, Maggie found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Women who had once whispered now pressed her hands warmly. Men who had speculated now offered congratulations and promises of help with the ranch. "It's a miracle," she murmured to Caleb as they finally found a moment alone. "No miracle," he said, drawing her close. "Just people remembering what community means, what family means." He smiled down at her. "Speaking of which, how does it feel to really be Mrs. Boone?" "Like coming home," she said, and meant it. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Sam asleep inside and the ranch settling into peaceful quiet, Maggie pulled out the journal she'd kept through their trials. "I've been writing it all down," she said. "Everything that's happened. Someday, when people ask how a mail-order bride who was left at the depot became mistress of the Circle B, we'll have the whole story." "What will you call it?" Caleb asked, amused. She thought for a moment, then smiled. "The truth, that a cowboy lifted my trunk and called me his wife, and in doing so, gave me everything I never knew I was looking for." "That's a long title," he teased. "Then we'll shorten it," she said, leaning into his warmth. "We'll call it The Day Love Arrived by Train." As if in agreement, a distant train whistle echoed across the desert, not a sound of abandonment this time, but a reminder that every ending was also a beginning, and that sometimes the best journeys were the ones that brought you home. The Circle B Ranch stood strong against the night, shelter and haven, testament to the power of love that chooses rather than settles, that protects rather than possesses, and that transforms convenient lies into inconvenient truths too powerful to deny. Winter came hard to Cedar Ridge that year, but the Circle B stood ready. The barn was repaired, the fences strong, and the pantry full of preserved goods from Maggie's restored garden. What they weren't prepared for was the letter that arrived 2 days before Christmas, carried by a rider who looked nervous to be bearing Merrick's seal. "It's a formal challenge," Caleb said, scanning the document. "He's calling in an old debt claims my father borrowed money from his, with the ranch as collateral. Says if I can't produce payment in full by New Year's Day, he has legal right to foreclose." "Can he do that?" Maggie asked, though the sinking feeling in her stomach already knew the answer. "If the debt's real, yes." Caleb's jaw tightened. "My father died when I was away fighting in the war. When I came back, papers were missing, records destroyed in a fire. I thought all debts were settled, but Merrick kept this one hidden, waiting for the right moment." Maggie's mind raced. "How much?" $5,000. The sum was staggering, more than the ranch made in 2 good years. Plus 20 years of interest. Sam, who'd been practicing his letters at the kitchen table, looked up with frightened eyes. "Are we going to lose our home?" "No," Maggie said firmly, though she had no idea how to keep that promise. "We'll find a way." The next days were a whirlwind of activity. Caleb rode to neighboring ranches, seeking loans or buyers for cattle. Maggie went through every document in the study, searching for any evidence that might dispute the claim. Sheriff Watson investigated but found that Merrick had covered his tracks well. The original loan document appeared genuine, filed properly in the territorial capital where no small-town sheriff could challenge it. On Christmas Eve, their efforts seemed hopeless. They'd raised barely a quarter of the needed sum, and time was running out. The household gathered in the parlor, trying to maintain holiday spirits for Sam's sake, but the weight of impending loss hung over them all. "I've been thinking," Martha said suddenly, "about that fire that destroyed your daddy's papers. Caleb always thought it was mighty convenient, happening just when it did." "What are you saying?" Caleb asked. "I'm saying maybe we've been looking in the wrong place. Your daddy was a careful man. Would he have kept all his important papers in one spot?" Hope flickered in Maggie's chest. "Where else would he keep them?" Martha smiled grimly. where any rancher with sense keeps his real valuables in the land itself. They spent Christmas Day differently than planned, not with feast and celebration, but with shovels and determination, following Martha's memory to an old line shack on the property's edge. There, beneath floorboards that hadn't been disturbed in decades, they found a metal box. Inside were papers that told a different story than Merrick's version. The debt had existed, yes, but it had been paid in cattle and land exchanges, all properly documented. And more damning still, there were letters between Merrick's father and other ranchers, outlining a scheme to destroy several smaller operations through false debts and forged documents. This proves everything, Maggie breathed. Not just about our case, but about a pattern of fraud going back 20 years. It's enough to hang him, Caleb said grimly, or at least send him to prison for a very long time. But Merrick wasn't finished. As they prepared to take their evidence to the authorities, he played his final card. Jake Thornton appeared at the ranch with a dozen armed men, all wearing deputy badges. "Judge Blackwood's orders," Jake announced with vicious satisfaction. "This property is under dispute, and we're here to secure it until the matter's resolved. Everyone out, except essential ranch personnel." "You mean except the men you can intimidate or buy off?" Caleb said coldly. "I mean what the judge says I mean." Jake's hand rested on his gun. "Mrs. Boone and the boy need to leave. Can't have civilians on disputed property." "Over my dead body." Caleb stepped forward, but Maggie caught his arm. "No," she said quietly. "No violence. That's what they want, an excuse to arrest you, to separate us." She looked at Jake steadily. "Sam and I will go to town, but this isn't over." Caleb started to protest. "Trust me," she said, pressing the box of documents into his hands where Jake couldn't see. "Guard these with your life. We'll be back." In town, Maggie didn't go to the hotel as expected. Instead, she marched straight to the telegraph office with Sam in tow. "I need to send multiple messages," she told the operator. "To the territorial governor, the federal marshal's office, and every newspaper from here to Denver." "That'll be expensive," the operator warned. "Send them," Maggie said firmly, producing the money they'd raised to pay Merrick's false debt. "And mark them urgent." The messages detailed everything: the fraud, the conspiracy, the armed takeover of the Circle B, the corruption of Judge Blackwood. She named names, cited evidence, and called for immediate intervention. "What now?" Sam asked as they left the telegraph office. "Now we fight differently than they expect," Maggie said. "They think they're dealing with a helpless Eastern woman. Time to show them otherwise." She gathered allies with surprising speed. Mrs. Henderson opened her home to them. Reverend Harlan organized prayer vigils that were really planning meetings. The banker Clearwater quietly froze Merrick's accounts pending investigation. Even some of Merrick's own men, disgusted by Jake's tactics, began passing information. 3 days after Christmas, as snow began to fall, the response came. Not just Sheriff Watson returning with territorial marshals, but something more: journalists from Denver and beyond, drawn by Maggie's telegrams promising a story of corruption and courage in the Wild West. "Mrs. Boone," one reporter said, pencil poised. "Is it true you were a mail-order bride abandoned at the depot?" "Yes," Maggie said simply. "And is it true that the man who claimed you sight unseen is now fighting to save his ranch from fraudulent seizure?" "He is. We are." She stood straighter. "This isn't just about one ranch. It's about whether money and threats can destroy honest people, or whether justice still means something in Cedar Ridge." The confrontation came at dawn on New Year's Eve. Merrick arrived at the Circle B with Judge Blackwood and more hired guns, only to find federal marshals waiting alongside what seemed like half the territory's press corps. "Silas Merrick," the lead marshal announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and suspected murder in the death of Eleanor Boone." "Murder," Merrick's face went white. "You can't prove I never—" "The men who pushed Mrs. Eleanor Boone have been found," Sheriff Watson said with satisfaction. "Seems they kept letters detailing their payment from you. Wanted insurance in case you tried to cheat them." As they led Merrick away in chains, Jake Thornton tried to slip away, but found his path blocked by Pedro and several Circle B hands. "Leaving so soon?" Pedro asked mildly. "But you haven't collected your pay." What followed wasn't pretty, but it was justice of a sort. Jake left Cedar Ridge that day and, according to later reports, kept riding until he hit Mexico. Judge Blackwood, faced with evidence of his corruption, resigned in disgrace before he too could be arrested. The territorial governor appointed a new judge, one whose first act was to confirm all debts against the Circle B were fraudulent and void. As the sun set on 1885, the Circle B ranch stood free and clear. The household gathered in the parlor, the real celebration they'd postponed from Christmas. Sam played carols on Eleanor's piano, which Maggie had learned he'd been secretly practicing. Martha had prepared a feast that could have fed half the county. And Caleb stood before the fireplace, raised a glass of brandy, and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. "A year ago, I was a dead man walking, going through motions, existing but not living. Then a woman got off a train, a woman brave enough to face down a town's judgment, strong enough to save this ranch, wise enough to see through necessary lies to necessary truths." He looked directly at Maggie. "You asked me once why I claimed you that day at the depot. Truth is, I think I recognized something in you, a refusal to be broken, a determination to protect what matters. What I didn't know was that in claiming you, you'd claim me right back. You'd claim this whole ranch, this family, and make us all better for it." "To Mrs. Boone," Martha raised her own glass, "who showed us that mail-order brides might come west looking for husbands, but sometimes they find heroes instead. And sometimes," she winked, "they become heroes themselves." "To family," Sam added, his young voice clear. "A real family, the kind you choose." "To justice," Pedro chimed in. "And to those brave enough to fight for it." As glasses clinked and laughter filled the room, Maggie felt tears slide down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. 6 months ago, she'd stepped off a train with nothing but hope and a dying brother. Now she had a home, a husband who loved her, a brother growing stronger every day, and a community that had learned to see beyond its prejudices. Later, as snow fell soft and silent outside, she and Caleb stood on the porch watching the last sunset of the year paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Any regrets?" he asked, arm warm around her shoulders. "Just one," she said, and felt him tense. "I wish we'd met differently. Wish you hadn't had to lose so much before we found each other." He relaxed, pulled her closer. "Can't change the past, but we can shape the future. What do you see in ours?" Maggie thought of the spring garden already planned, the cattle drive Caleb would lead come summer, the school Sam would attend, the children she hoped would fill this house with laughter, the challenges they'd face and overcome together. "I see life," she said simply. "Real, messy, difficult, wonderful life, together." As 1885 gave way to 1886, church bells rang across Cedar Ridge. The sound carried over the snow-covered plains, a declaration that despite hardship and hatred, love and justice could still prevail. The Circle B Ranch stood as proof, a testament to the power of unlikely beginnings, necessary lies that became unnecessary truths, and the courage of a mail-order bride who'd been left at the depot until a cowboy lifted her trunk and called her his wife, setting in motion a story of redemption that would be told in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. Spring came early to Cedar Ridge in 1886, painting the desert in unexpected colors. The Circle B Ranch hummed with new life calves in the pasture, herbs flourishing in Maggie's expanded garden, and the sound of Sam's laughter as he raced across the yard. Healthy at last. The trials of winter seemed like a distant nightmare, though their echoes still shaped the present. Maggie stood in the garden, basket in hand, when she heard the approach of horses. These days, visitors didn't spark the old fear, but she remained watchful. The lead rider surprised her, a well-dressed woman of middle years, followed by what appeared to be lawyers from Denver. Mrs. Boone. The woman dismounted with practiced ease. I'm Catherine Merrick. Silas was my brother. Maggie's hand tightened on the basket handle, but she kept her voice steady. Ma'am. Please don't be alarmed. I've come to make amends, if such a thing is possible. Catherine's face showed genuine distress. I've been investigating my brother's affairs since his arrest. What I found sickened me. The fraud, the violence, and Eleanor Boone. She paused, composing herself. I knew Silas was ambitious, even ruthless in business. I didn't know he was a murderer. Caleb appeared from the barn, moving to stand beside Maggie. His presence was protective, but not threatening. Miss Merrick. Mr. Boone, I'll be direct. I can't undo what my brother did, but I can try to make reparations. She gestured to the lawyers. I'm dissolving his holdings, selling the Double Bar M. Part of the proceeds will go to restitution for all the families he cheated. For you, specifically, I wanted to return this. One of the lawyers produced a small wooden box. Inside lay a gold locket on a delicate chain. Caleb's breath caught. Eleanor's, he said roughly. She was wearing it when my brother's men killed her. Yes. Catherine's voice was steady, despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. It was among his things. There were others' trophies, I suppose you'd call them, evidence of crimes going back 20 years. She turned to Maggie. I know you have no reason to forgive my family's name, but I wanted you to know that not all Merricks are cut from the same cloth, and I wanted to thank you. Thank me, Maggie asked, startled, for having the courage to stand up to him, for ending his reign of terror. How many more would have suffered if you hadn't acted? Catherine remounted her horse. The sale will be finalized within the month. The Circle B will receive fair compensation for all damages and losses. It's not enough, but it's a start. After she left, Caleb stood holding the locket, lost in memory. Eleanor loved this, he said quietly. Her mother's, passed down through generations. She'd have wanted... He trailed off, then held it out to Maggie. She'd have wanted it to stay in the family, to be worn by someone who understood its worth. Maggie's eyes filled as he fastened it around her neck. The weight of it was more than gold, it was trust, acceptance, the final laying to rest of old ghosts. Days passed in a blur of spring work planting, calving, mending. The ranch prospered as never before, with honest hands hired to replace Jake's corrupt crew. Pedro was made foreman, a position he accepted with quiet pride. The house rang with music as Sam practiced piano, preparing for a recital at the church social. It was there, at that social, that Maggie noticed something wrong. She'd been feeling tired lately, dizzy in the mornings, but attributed it to the busy season. Now, standing in the church hall surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends, the room suddenly spun. Caleb caught her as she swayed. What's wrong? I don't... The world tilted, and darkness claimed her. She woke in Doc Pritchard's office, Caleb's worried face hovering above her. The doctor, who'd finally been convinced to treat the Boone family after Merrick's fall, wore an odd expression, part concern, part amusement. Well, Mrs. Boone, he said, washing his hands. I'd say you've been working too hard, but that's not the whole story. When did you last have your monthly time? Heat flooded Maggie's cheeks as understanding dawned. 2 months, maybe 3, but I thought with all the strain... Strain can delay things, true enough, but in this case... The doctor smiled. Congratulations are in order. Come late autumn, the Circle B will have a new addition. Caleb's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, joy, fear, and back to joy. A baby. His voice cracked like a boy's. We're having a baby. Appears so, Doc Pritchard said dryly. I'd recommend less excitement and more rest for the mother-to-be. The ride home passed in dazed silence until Sam, who'd been staying with Martha at the ranch, came running to meet them. Is Maggie sick? He asked anxiously. Is it the consumption, did I? No, sweetheart. Maggie hugged him carefully. I'm not sick. I'm going to have a baby. Sam's eyes went wide. A baby, a real baby, will I be an uncle? The best uncle, Caleb confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair. Think you're up for the job? Yes. Sam's whoop of joy could probably be heard in town. Wait until I tell everyone I'm going to be an uncle. Martha's reaction was more subdued, but no less pleased. About time, she said, trying to hide her tears. This house has been too quiet too long. Eleanor would be so happy. That evening, as sunset painted the sky, Maggie found herself in the garden with her journal, trying to capture the day's momentous news. Caleb joined her, settling his large frame beside her on the bench. You're quiet, he observed. Having second thoughts? No, just thinking about the journey. 6 months ago, I was nobody, a failed mail-order bride with a dying brother and no prospects. Now, she gestured at the thriving garden, the solid house, the man beside her. Now I have everything I never dared dream of. You were never nobody, Caleb said firmly. From that first moment at the depot, you were someone brave enough to face down a hostile town, strong enough to fight for this place, generous enough to heal old wounds. You didn't find a life here. Maggie, you built one. We built one. She leaned into his warmth. I was thinking about the baby. What kind of world we're bringing them into. A better one than we found, he said simply. Look at Cedar Ridge now, folks, helping each other instead of judging. Justice prevailing over corruption. Second chances bearing fruit. That's your doing as much as anyone's. Our doing, she corrected. All of us together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Then Maggie spoke again, softly. I want to name the baby Eleanor if it's a girl. Would that be all right? Caleb's arm tightened around her. She'd have loved that. Loved you. You're the sister she never had. The friend this town wouldn't let her be. And if it's a boy? Samuel, they said together, then laughed. Though maybe we should ask Sam first, Maggie added. He might not want to share his name. Are you kidding? He'll insist on it. That boy worships the ground you walk on. Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple. As do I, Mrs. Boone, as do I. Summer rolled into autumn, and Maggie's condition became obvious to all. The ladies of Cedar Ridge, who'd once whispered behind their hands about the mail-order bride, now showered her with advice and hand-sewn baby clothes. The transformation was complete. She was no longer an outsider, but the heart of the community. The baby came with the first snow, arriving with the same determination that characterized everything about the Boone family. It was a difficult birth hours of labor that had Caleb wearing grooves in the parlor floor, but when Doc Pritchard finally emerged, his smile told the story. A daughter, he announced, healthy and loud as her parents. Little Eleanor Martha Boone had her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. Sam declared her perfect and immediately appointed himself chief protector, reading to her from his school books and playing gentle melodies on the piano. As Maggie recovered, she found herself one evening writing the final entry in the journal she'd kept throughout their trials. I came west seeking survival and found life abundant. I answered an advertisement for a wife and discovered what it means to be truly chosen. They say I was a mail-order bride left at the depot, and that's true as far as it goes. But the real truth is richer. I was lifted up by love, carried by courage, and planted in soil that helped me bloom. Asterisk. The Circle B Ranch stands strong, a testament to the power of unlikely families and necessary lies that become beautiful truths. Sam grows taller and stronger each day, his laughter no longer interrupted by coughs. Caleb has found his smile again, and it lights up rooms like sunrise over the desert. Baby Eleanor sleeps in the cradle her father carved, surrounded by love that conquered prejudice and greed. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, it always does, but we'll face them together. This family forged not by blood alone, but by choice, by struggle, by the daily decision to claim each other against all odds. I was not saved. I was chosen, and in choosing back, I found that the greatest adventures don't always lead you far from home. Sometimes they lead you straight to it. Maggie closed the journal and looked around the parlor. Sam dozed by the fire, a book forgotten in his lap. Caleb sat in his chair, Eleanor cradled in his massive arms, humming a lullaby she recognized as one Eleanor the First must have sung. Martha bustled in the kitchen, preparing evening tea with herbs from the garden that now supplied half the county with medicinal plants. Outside, snow fell soft on the Circle B, blanketing the scars of old battles, promising fresh starts come spring. The train whistle echoed across the plains, that same sound that had once meant abandonment, now simply marking time's passage, bringing supplies and taking cattle to market, connecting their remote corner of the world to the larger tapestry of America, growing and changing. But here, in this moment, in this place they'd fought to keep and transform, all was peace. A mail-order bride had been left at the depot. It was true. But from that moment of desperation had grown a love story for the ages, not the fairy tale kind, with easy answers and perfect endings, but the real kind, built on daily choices, sacrifice, and the radical act of seeing people not as they appear but as they truly are. Caleb looked up, caught her watching, and smiled that smile she'd worked so hard to earn and now received freely as her right and privilege. "Come here," he said softly, making room for her beside him. She went, settling against his warmth, their daughter between them, their son nearby, their friend in the kitchen, their home around them like a blessing made manifest. Tomorrow would come with its demands, but tonight they were complete, a family born of necessity, tested by fire, and bound by the strongest force in any frontier, the choice to love without reservation, to build without fear, and to stand together against whatever storms might come. The Circle B ranch slept peaceful under starlight, and all was well. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and redemption in the Old West. I hope Maggie and Caleb's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more tales of the American frontier. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help more people discover these stories of hope and humanity. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own happy endings.